Warmer and sunny days are already here, and I would trade anything for a bit of sunshine after those long colder months. To cherish these sunny times, I made this cute little fabric bag charm, and it's a fun little project to get rid of your fabric scraps. I used my sewing machine for a part of it, but you can completely hand stitch it easily. Final measurements of this charm are 4.5 by 3 inches, and now let's see what are the materials and tools. You'll need fabric of your choice. I have selected 2 different types of cotton fabric: embroidery threads, pins and a needle, a pair of scissors, a fabric marking pen, a key ring, a small piece of ribbon. This one measures 2.5 inches in length. Something with a blunt end like a wooden rod to poke the edges, and your free PDF pattern. I forgot to place one more important thing here. You will need some fiber fill for stuffing. Make sure you got that too. I'm also using my sewing machine and a coordinating thread for that. Let's start with cutting the pattern pieces out. This pattern is free to download, and you will find the link to that in the description below. It's a simple pattern and only needs these 2 pattern pieces to complete the entire project. Now, using those pattern pieces, let's start to cut the fabric pieces. The required number of fabric pieces is mentioned on or near each template piece. I'm going to start with the triangular shape pattern piece. As I mentioned in the pattern, you will need 10 from this, which is 5 pairs. Easiest way is to fold your fabric in half to meet the right sides facing each other. Then place the pattern on top of it, and then use a pin to hold the pattern to both fabric layers underneath. This way, both layers stay intact, and you can then carefully cut around the pattern. This will be the rays for the sun, and I recommend you to cut these as pairs like the way I do, because we have to sew each pair one by one later, and this will make things easier. Finally, remove the pin, and as you can see, we have 2 identical pieces facing right sides together, ready to sew as we go to next steps. There is another way to cut those rays. First, place the pattern piece on top of the both layers and outline it while holding the pattern. Use a fabric marking pen, and this one is a heat erasable fabric marking pen. Once you have outlined the pattern, use a pin to hold the 2 fabric layers together and cut around the drawn pattern. Now, if you prefer cutting 10 separate pieces, after you have cut all the pieces, place one piece on top of the other facing right sides together to make a pair like this. Either way, arrange these as 5 pairs, and then it will be easier to sew later. Finally, remove the pin. You can use any of these methods to cut the other 3 pairs from this pattern piece. Now let's move to cut the other pattern piece. It's the same as we did earlier. Fold the fabric in half and pin and place the pattern onto both layers. This is going to be the midsection of the sun, and I have specifically selected the plain color fabric because then I can do a little embroidery here. After you have pinned and placed the pattern, carefully cut around it. You can also outline it first if you are more comfortable that way. Finally, remove the pins and you will easily get the required 2 pieces from that pattern. Now it's the embroidery part. I'm going to sew a few random French knots on this half circle piece, and if you're using a printed fabric, this part is not that necessary. Thread your needle, and I'm using all 6 embroidery strands to complete this part. To secure your stitches, make sure to make a knot at the end. Take the right side of one of the half circle pieces and keep in mind that we need to leave a little bit of space at all the edges for seam allowance. Now coming from the back of the fabric, start to do some French knots. If you don't know how to do the French knot, make sure to follow our tutorial first. I'll leave the link in the description. The French knot is one of my favorite stitches in hand embroidery, and I think it will give more of an elegant look to our bag charm. One more thing, the best practice to do any embroidery is using an embroidery hoop. It allows the fabric to stretch properly and keep your stitches nice and neat. But I must admit I'm too lazy to do that today, but I'll show you how to do that too. If you are a beginner to hand sewing and embroidery, I definitely recommend you using an embroidery hoop for this part. First, set up your fabric to the embroidery hoop and then place the pattern on top of the fabric and outline it using a fabric marking pen. Remove the pattern once you outlined it. As now you have a properly stretched fabric to work with, it'll be much easier to do the French knots. Now coming from the back of the fabric, make a few French knots randomly in the midsection, leaving a little space around the edges for seam allowance. In this case, whenever you complete doing all the French knots, you can then cut out the pattern piece carefully. Now please don't judge me, I'm going to continue the way I started to do the French knots. I mean, at least I showed you the right way, and as for myself, I don't mind a bit of messiness in my sewing projects. I think at this point we have enough French knots, and let's end the stitch at the back of the fabric. Turn over to the wrong side of the fabric and make a couple of knots using any of the threads nearby. Finally, trim the thread. Now this is the look from the front, and if you would like, you can do the same with the other piece as well. I think it's gonna look better with French knots on both sides since this is for a bag charm. Now it's time for sewing, and let's go with the sun rays first. Take one pair at a time, and we are gonna sew the two sides that make the pointy end, leaving the bottom circular part open to turn the right side out. I'm using my sewing machine, but you can hand sew if you would like. Start at the one of the end and make sure to do a little back stitch at the beginning. Since these are smaller pieces, go a little slow, and when you reach the pointy end, stop and pivot while the needle is down. Then start to sew again. Also do a little back stitch at the ending and finally trim the thread. Do the same with the other pairs as well. If you don't do the back stitch at the beginning and at the ending, then things will get loose when you turn the right side out. So make sure you do that if you are using a sewing machine like I do. But this won't be a problem if you are hand sewing. At this point, we are done with all 5 pairs and let's get these ready to turn right side out. To reduce the bulky parts, trim the pointy ends without damaging any stitches and also trim any hanging threads. Now one by one, turn these right sides out using the opening we left. Be a little patient and slowly pull the fabric out. You'll need to use something with a blunt end like this wooden rod to poke out the pointy end. Also, please don't poke it too hard, otherwise you're going to damage the fabric. One by one, turn all 5 pairs right sides out. They all look fine and let's give a small press to all of these to make them nice and flat. Now it's time to assemble everything together. Place one of the half circle pieces facing right side up. Take one of the sun rays and place it on the middle of the curved edge. You can just eyeball it, it doesn't have to be precise. Now place another 2 pairs adjacent to that on one side and the remaining 2 on the other side of the curved edge. I'm not leaving any gaps between the rays and also no overlapping. We are leaving a bit of space at the straight edge for the final steps and try to place these rays as symmetrical as possible. Now take your piece of ribbon and fold it in half. Place it on top of the middle ray and while holding that, I'm going to place the final piece. Final piece is the other half circle and place that on top facing the right sides together. Both half circles are aligning and facing right sides together at this point. Now without moving anything, use a few pins to hold everything in place. I recommend you use craft clips if you have any, but I don't have craft clips at the moment and pins work just fine. Try your best to keep everything as we arranged earlier. You can check from the sides to see whether everything is in place. Now we are going to sew along the circular edge. Leave the bottom straight edge open to turn the right side out and to stuff some fiber fill. Start at one end and do a little back stitch at the beginning. Leave less than a 1/4 inch seam allowance and move the fabric slowly to keep the circular shape. Remove the pins or clips as you go, and as we have several pieces in between the layers, you have to be extra careful when you do that. Remember to do a little back stitch at the end and finally trim the thread. Since this is a small seam area and we got a ribbon and a few rays along the edge, I want to add a bit of strength to our back charm. Because of that, I'm going to sew one more round just to keep things stronger. It's all the same, backstitch at the beginning and at the ending and sew along the circular edge. You can skip this part if you are okay with one round of sewing. We are almost at the end and now turn the right side out using the opening we left. Be careful not to damage those French knots while you are doing that. It's already looking good and we only have a few more steps to go. I'm gonna give a little press at the edges just to keep the creases, and please do not press the French knots. We have to finally close this opening, and for that I'm folding about a 1/4 inch inwards all around the opening and gonna give it a press to keep the fold. You can simply sew this using your sewing machine, but since we are gonna stuff this bag charm, I feel like hand sewing this part is much easier. For that, thread your needle with the matching embroidery thread color and make a knot at the end. Let's start stuffing first. Stuff a little fiber fill at a time. Moderate amount of stuffing is better to keep the shape and to get that soft plushy feeling. You can even use a wooden rod like this to reach the corners when stuffing. Once you have stuffed enough, start to enclose the opening. Start from one end and in between the two layers to hide away the knot. Raw edges won't be visible to the outside since we fold the raw edges inward. I'm using the back stitch to enclose the opening and sew straight and closer to the edge. We also have a detailed tutorial on the back stitch and I'll leave the link for you in the description. You can also stuff more while you are sewing if you would like. I already have a felt sun in my shop and I wanted to make a fabric sun for a while now. I think this is a little similar to that one. If you are looking for a simple spring and summer craft and you also want to use up your fabric scraps, this would be a perfect fit for you. This project suits both hand sewing and machine sewing, so don't stop yourself if you don't own a sewing machine. Once you reach the other end, make a couple of knots using the threads just right next to it. Make sure they are tight enough and then insert the needle in between the two layers and come through only one. Pull the needle towards you and finally trim the thread. This is how our bag charm looks at the end, and of course we need to add a key ring to this using the ribbon at the top. With that, the sunshine bag charm is ready to use. I mean, you can use it as a bag charm, a keychain, make it into an ornament, or enlarge the pattern to make it into a larger plushie. I hope you'll try making one of your own and love to know what you think of this. Please subscribe to the channel for me to grow and for you to see more DIY projects and tutorials. Thank you for watching and I'll join you in the next one.